So again, in English, I'm very happy to be here with you today. This is an extremely important process that is emerging within the Red Cross, and I'm extremely happy to contribute to your thinking and this ongoing process today. I wanted to start with this image of the recent commemoration of the 3rd of October 2013 shipwreck in Lampedusa. It's an image I'll come back to towards the end of my presentation. It's extremely important for me, on the one hand, because of this process of commemoration that has been going on since several years in relation to this shipwreck, and which has also been institutionalized in Italy. This is a commemoration which, since several years, drew the participation of high-level politicians from the Italian state. And it's an extraordinary example of the recognition of the lives and dignity and the memory of the people who have died by trying to cross the sea. But in fact, this specific commemoration is also, for me, somehow paradigmatic of our current moment. In fact, as you can faintly see on this slide, there is only one politician present here at this year's commemoration just a few weeks ago, and it is the mayor, the current mayor of Lampedusa. No other state representative of the Italian state made the effort to join this commemoration. I think this speaks to the current climate that we are in, to this moment where the lives of migrants in Italy and in Europe have lost even symbolic value. It is no longer even necessary for Italian politicians to even symbolically address the lives of migrants, and as it has been, and I'm going to talk about that in my presentation, as it has been over the last years, justify some of their policies in the name of preventing the deaths at sea. This seems to be no longer even necessary in this current moment. So it's a very challenging moment, as we were just discussing a moment ago. It feels a bit, for someone like myself who has been working on this issue since 2011, it feels a bit like being back at square one. And I think that the initiative that you are taking part in, and the work that ourselves and many other actors from civil society stubbornly continue, in fact, is all the more important in this context. I would see that, in a sense, while you seek to identify the dead and to reunite, to identify the families of the dead, and this is fundamental, to treat the dead and their families with dignity. In a way, the work that we have been doing within forensic oceanography, of seeking to document the conditions and the responsibilities for specific shipwrecks and the broader policies within which these shipwrecks and these specific violations are inscribed. In a sense, it's another dimension of seeking to treat the dead with dignity. In fact, we would expect of our states to investigate any situation of death that has occurred on their territory or in a situation that was under their effective control, such as the Mediterranean frontier. And needless to say, if a shipwreck occurs involving European citizens, these investigations are initiated immediately. And so I would see the work that we have done also as anchored in the imperative to treat migrants as subjects of equal worth. And so what I would like to do today with you is to analyze, introduce, really quite summarily in fact, some of the conditions and policies that have led to the structural deaths of migrants at sea since the beginning of the 90s in particular. You know, I'm sure there are more than 30,000 deaths that have been documented at the maritime frontier, meaning that there are, of course, many more. Bonjour. Many more deaths that leave as only trace the haunting absence for their families. So, one of the sources concerning migrants' deaths, in particular at the borders, is the IOM. And as you can see from this map, migrant deaths occur in many different regions in the world. I would say that mostly these deaths occur along different fault lines of the world system where mobility conflicts emerge. These are regions of marked inequality or where a process of racialization as well is at work. Let us just think of Mexico, let's think of course of the Mediterranean, which is my own focus, but also Australia, also South Africa, or the Gulf of Aden, which links the African continent and the Arabian Peninsula. So, migrants' deaths occur wherever we have marked situations of what I like to call mobility conflicts. That is a situation in which the policies of closure of states clash with the desires and the reality of the movements of migrants. And in a sense, I would say also that these policies of closure clash with the systemic conditions within which migration is embedded. We can come back to that maybe after, but migration policies are only one of the many factors that shape the dynamics of migration. And if they are at odds with those broader systemic conditions, they are certain to lead to failure, evasion, and a great deal of human suffering. So this is just to somehow locate the Mediterranean frontier and the conditions that lead to migrants' deaths in the Mediterranean within a broader context of multiple mobility conflicts that emerge in somehow the fault lines of inequality within our world system. So as you know, as you saw as well from the previous map, the Mediterranean is the zone in which most migrants' deaths are recorded. And I won't be speaking very much about that actually, but I would say that the deaths that are recorded in the Saharan desert, but also those that are increasingly recorded across the Alps today, are somehow ripple effects, if you will, shadow effects of this main fault line, right? The deaths in the Sahara are the product of state actors that seek to prevent migrants from crossing the desert because they do not wish them to reach the Mediterranean shores. And likewise, the deaths in the Alps are the product of the difficulty and the constraints on migrants' onward movement across European space. just a note on data sources. You might know, I imagine, that the data on arrivals are mostly the product of registered by states and their different agencies, brought together at the European level as well by Frontex, the European Coast Guard Agency, whereas there is no unified system for counting deaths at borders. In fact, no even unified definition of what deaths at borders are. And the first actors that began counting migrant deaths were initially emerged from civil society. The first one in Europe was United, the United Network, United, it's always difficult, United against refugee, United against, United for Intercultural Action, yeah, European Network Against Nationalism, Racism, Fascism, and in support of migrants and refugees. Let's call them United. They began this process as of 1993 with a broad network of civil society actors. They were joined a few years later, I believe at the beginning of the 2000s, by a group called Fortress Europe in Italy. And since 2013, the IOM is also counting deaths at the borders. There are yet other sources, that's, for example, the migrant files that seek to combine these different databases together, but which has stopped operating at present. So let's say that for the long-term trends, we rather use United, which is the most complete database. But for recent evolutions, the most regularly up-to-date, in fact, is the IOM, and it's often on this source that we rely at present. For those who are interested in this, I wrote a short article report on these different sources, but also the politics of these different sources with my friend and co-author Antoine Bécou. Now, if we want to think of how and why this Mediterranean mobility conflict emerges, even though illegalized migration and the death of migrants at sea have really become structural since the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, I think really if we want to understand this mobility conflict, we need to trace it back much earlier, in fact, to the beginning of the 19th century and this phase of European imperial expansion across the Mediterranean. It's really from that moment that we see this structural mobility conflict and a hierarchized mobility regime emerge. In fact, if you look prior to that time, you have, for example, the regime of captivity. Oh, suddenly I forget the exact figures, but I believe that more than 3 million people were held captive over the couple of centuries, just before the 19th century, held captive by actors on both shores. Christians were held captive in North Africa, Muslims were held captive, and at times both were mutually enslaving each other in European Christian countries. What is really interesting when we look at this phase is that we have somehow incessant conflicts between both shores, and clearly the freedom of seafarers being regularly interrupted by raids and captivity. But we have a situation of what Samir Amin, who passed away recently, would call a conniving rivalry. In fact, these incessant conflicts were a marker of relative equality. You see, sometimes I think of my two kids. I have two young boys. Sometimes I would like them not to fight as much as they sometimes do. But the truth is that if they fight a bit, it's a marker of equality, in a way. That equality is precisely what is deeply challenged by European colonial domination on the southern shores. And a regime of hierarchized mobility was inextricably bound to this increasing domination, European domination. First, as you know, European populations, mostly from the southern shores of Europe, such as Sicily or Malta, emigrated in great numbers towards the southern shores of the Mediterranean, such as Algeria or Tunisia. And in fact, by 1830 in Tunis, a city where I lived for a couple of years, Maltese were extremely numerous and had a very bad reputation. They were accused of being involved in all sorts of crimes. And when in about 1830, the Bey of Tunis refused the disembarkation of a vessel carrying several hundred Maltese, that ship received the support of a British warship to force the Bey of Tunis to open its port. So somehow it's an example of the way the movement of European migrants towards North Africa was embedded in these increasingly asymmetrical power relations. In turn, when, as of the beginning of the 20th century, we've just marked the commemoration of the end of the First World War, it's really during the First World War that colonized subjects are recruited in great numbers into European armies, but also into European industries. And immediately after the end of the hostilities, stricter limits are imposed to the movement of the colonized. And in the colonized, as today, sought to contest and evade those increasing restrictions. For example, the freedom to move towards metropolitan France became one of the demands of the emerging anti-colonial movement. But also, the colonized used more subtle forms of contestation through evasion of those policies of control. And this precaritized, as it does today, their trajectories. In 1926, if I'm not mistaken, more than 20 people, 20 bodies were of the Algerian population. It's difficult to say Algerian nationals, since Algeria was part of France at the time. Algerian subjects were discovered in the hold of a boat connecting Algiers to Marseille. And so this is very important for me to emphasize the longue durée history of this hierarchized mobility regime, and the way, in fact, restrictions on movement, which were at odds with the dynamics of migration, already then began leading to early forms of migrants' deaths. Now, following the Second World War, as I'm sure you know, we see phases of recruitment, labor recruitment by different European countries, but also quite quickly, in fact, restrictions that are imposed on migrants' movements from the colonies. Often we date restrictions. Good morning. Very happy to see my dear friend Father Mousse join us. We'll see as I speak of some of the cases that we've worked on that our friendship and collaboration dates back to a few years now. So, often historians of migration somehow mark the end of labor recruitment with the oil crisis of 1973 and increasing unemployment in Europe. In fact, very often in the UK, but also in France, restrictions are imposed shortly before that time, not so much in response to economic crisis and unemployment, but rather to racial tensions surrounding the arrival of colonial and then post-colonial populations. But in fact, there's really kind of there's a progressive geography of closure that emerges, and that has a variegated temporality, if you will, across European space, which I would say, broadly speaking, Western and Northern European countries imposing restrictions relatively earlier, and Southern countries such as Spain, Italy, Greece, who were at a very different moment in their migration trajectories. Initially, they were rather emigration countries, imposed their restrictions much later and in a more fragmented way. Essentially, what we see is that the process of unification of Europe, but also of freedom of movement specifically within Europe, leads to the increasing denial to non-European migrants, citizens of the global South, to access European territory. Now, since there were long-standing historical migration connections established between Europe and different countries of the global South, and there were conditions of economic crisis, war on the one hand, but also a structural need for precaritized labor on the other hand in European economies, these growing restrictions did not simply lead to the end of migration from the global South, but rather led to the increasing illegalization of migration and to a growing number of deaths amongst migrants seeking to reach European territory. Now, amongst the more than 30,000 deaths that have been recorded at the maritime frontiers over the last 30 years, most migrants have not died, as one might imagine, along other land borders of, for example, border guards shooting at migrants seeking to cross a sea which has become an extended frontier zone. Most migrants have died not only at sea, but through the sea. The sea has become a deadly liquid for those who seek to cross the sea without authorization. The sea has been turned into a deadly element by policies that exclude, illegalize, and precarize migrants' entire journeys. So somehow we can think of the sea as mediating between policies of exclusion and the bodies of migrants. Right? Now, in this mediation, there are also several mechanisms that needs to be mentioned and that contribute to the structural death of migrants at sea. The first is that, again, migrants who were illegalized, denied access to safe means of transport, had to somehow create an alternative infrastructure of transport. Denied access to air travel, safe air travel, or safe sea travel. Migrants had to create and resort to a kind of parallel transport infrastructure made as much of actual means of transport as people, migrants, but also smugglers. This is a map drawn by a migrant who was intercepted at the border between Algeria and Morocco, close to Oujda. And precisely the fact that this map came into the possession of state actors at the moment of the interception of this migrant subject indicates that for states, it's increasingly the entire trajectories and the entire infrastructure of movement which becomes the object of control. Now, what this means in terms of migrants' trajectories is very clear. Whereas in all areas of crossing that I am familiar with, initially the crossing is operated by fishermen, those who live and operate daily in the maritime environment. Here, this is a photograph, a video image taken in southern Morocco, in the area of Laayoune, where migrants initially resorted to the service of fishermen who, on an occasional basis, would provide either for free, but mostly for a small sum, this service of illegalized passage. Now, as progressively the coast became increasingly controlled and surveyed by state actors, and the movement of these barks became monitored, that service of illegalized passage came into the hands of much more structured and criminal organizations, which by 2005 were forcing migrants to build their own boats in the desert, often abandoning them to their fate when those migrants were not discovered by joint patrols between Moroccan and Spanish military, and the boats that they were building with their bare hands destroyed. So what is very important here is that the illegalization and criminalization of migration increasingly leads to the criminalization of all interaction with illegalized migrants. And this pushes them into the hands of more or less criminal, more or less scrupulous networks that, of course, lead to greater risk for them in seeking to cross the sea. Here, I assume that a distinction which you've all come across of, but which is important to recall, the distinction between smuggling and trafficking. Smuggling as the procurement of a financial or other material benefit of the illegal entry of a person into a state party to the UN Protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land. So we're talking about an interaction which entails the handing over of some form of benefit for a service. And that interaction stops after the service is fulfilled, the crossing of a particular border. Trafficking, instead, entails the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of person by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, abuse of power or position of vulnerability, or the giving or receiving of payment to achieve the consent of a person, having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Trafficking then entails much greater use of force, of coercion, and often does not end simply with the service of the passage the illegalized passage of a border. Clearly, the border between smuggling and trafficking is at times difficult to draw in a very clear way. But if I think now specifically of the situation in Libya, clearly we have a situation which has increasingly tended towards trafficking, in which migrants who may have began their trajectories in an autonomous way and sought the service of smugglers along different borders until they reached Libya, increasingly lost their freedom as they entered Libya and became an object that was passed on from one hand to the other, with different forms of violence, exercise, of coercion, and exploitation. A second mechanism that I want to mention, which is important in the structural production of death at the maritime frontiers, is somehow the collateral effect of policies of state control at sea itself. Now, when states, I just mentioned the route leading to from southern Morocco, from the area of Laayoune to the Canaries. This is an area that was extremely intensely used as of 2004, 2005, and through 2006, 2007. In fact, I don't have the figures here, but prior to this time, from across throughout the 90s, migrants had mainly crossed through the Gibraltar Strait, which is a much shorter stretch of sea, only 14 kilometers wide. Now, the progressive militarization of the Gibraltar Strait pushed migrants' trajectories further along the coast until they reached all the way down south, where they sought to cross the Canary Islands, crossing here a stretch of sea which is more than 120 kilometers long and in much rougher Atlantic waters. Following the shooting against migrants who sought to enter the enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla in 2005, most migrants began, in fact, skipping the passage through Algeria and northern Morocco towards southern Morocco altogether, and departing from Senegal and Mauritania directly, again, a stretch of sea which was even longer than that from southern Morocco. So this example somehow allows to indicate this logic of splintering routes. When one route is closed, it's usually only a matter of time for another route to be opened, often in more dangerous conditions, whether it's a matter of the length of the trajectory or the smuggling methods being used. And you can see this, if you will, as well in relation to this graph with the different routes. You can see really how the intensity of crossing along a particular route, which again should be subdivided for Spain, for example, into Mediterranean and Atlantic, constantly oscillates, but never quite stops. And as you can see from this graph, the absolute number of deaths grew throughout the 2000s in particular. In relation to the growing number of crossings, over the 2000s we see the crossings by North African nationals progressively being joined by sub-Saharan nationals as of the beginning of the 2000s. But it's not only, these increasing deaths are not only the product of increasing number of crossings, but also a growing mortality rate. the mortality rate being a measure of the danger of crossing the sea. There would be issues as to the calculation of the mortality rates that we could go into if you would like, but essentially the mortality rate is a relation between the number of people who leave and the number of deaths. But since, even though the number of people who arrive is relatively well known, at least throughout the 2000s, clearly the number of deaths is not known perfectly. And so the calculation of mortality can only be an estimate that allows to indicate tendencies, but not a statistically valid and reliable measure. Nevertheless, the tendency is quite clear throughout the 2000s, a tendency towards a growing danger in the crossing of the sea, as a result of these different mechanisms that we can analyze. Finally, a last mechanism which I want to mention concerns essentially what happens to migrants once they are in situations of distress at sea and cases of non-assistance to migrants at sea. Again, if we come back to this image I showed earlier on, it gives us the impression of the sea as an infinite expanse that somehow resides outside the law. And this impression of the sea, the oceans, as lawless spaces are really very much reproduced by the average maps that you might consult, whether it's an atlas or whether it's Google Maps. Usually what you will have is land-based territories mapped with great details, with cities, roads, political boundaries, but the oceans left as empty expanses, abstract spaces. In fact, the seas are saturated by jurisdictions. Jurisdictions, however, that operate in a particular way in relation to firm land. The way we like to think of it is the sea as a form of unbundled sovereignty, using the term proposed by Saskia Sassen. Just think of the sovereignty on firm land. You have rights and obligations kind of neatly stacked, one on top of the other, and corresponding to the boundary of a territorial state. At sea, what you have instead are rights and obligations of coastal states, but also flag states, that are somehow disaggregated and extended to different spatial extents. So you see this here. For example, up to 12 nautical miles, essentially the state has full sovereignty. It's almost as if you're still on firm land. In the contiguous zone, which can be declared by a state, that extends up to 24 nautical miles, we're no longer in a situation of full sovereignty, but a situation in which the coastal state can still exercise essentially control functions. For example, controlling vessels that are incoming, or suddenly I'm forgetting the term in English, des droits de douane. Then you have the exclusive economic zones in which a state can exercise the monopoly over the exploitation of specific resources, be it mineral or gas, oil, or other, or fisheries. So again, think of this as a form of unbundled sovereignty, where you have rights and obligations that are separated from each other and extended to different spatial extends. Importantly, for what interests us, coastal states also are required to coordinate rescue within corresponding search and rescue zones, which you see faintly here indicated in, by these red lines. Now, coastal states must coordinate rescue. I'm going to come back to that in a second. But equally, any ship at sea is required to, let me read the passage from the United Nations laws of the sea. Every state shall require the master of a ship flying its flag, insofar as he can do so without serious danger to the ship, the crew, or the passengers, to render assistance to any person found at sea in danger of being lost, to proceed with all possible speed to the rescue of persons in distress, if informed of their need of assistance, right? So any vessel, again, we think of the Mediterranean as this empty expanse, but actually 30% of maritime traffic transits through the Mediterranean. If you look at the Strait of Sicily here, it looks a bit like London or Paris at rush hour. Now, any of those vessels is required by law to assist any person found in distress. In turn, again, concerning the states party to the UNCLOS Convention are required to promote the establishment, operation, and maintenance of adequate and effective search and rescue services. The government responsible for the SAR region in which survivors were covered is responsible for providing a place of safety, very important notion, or ensuring that such a place of safety is provided. And importantly, clearly when concerning migrants and possible refugees, asylum seekers, it is not only the norms governing the laws of the sea that are important for ships or coastal states, but also the norms concerning the status of refugees, and in particular, the obligation of non-refoulement. Which is an extremely important principle and forbids the expulsion or return to the frontiers of territory where his or her life or freedom would be threatened on account of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership, or belonging to a particular group or political opinion. Now, despite these norms, and in relation to this very specific zone of unbundled sovereignty that is the sea, you see that in fact there are numerous conflicts that emerge between coastal states. For example, here you see the overlapping areas between Italy, which I'm drawing somehow here with my hand. You see here are the islands, this is the island of Lampedusa. So the Italian SAR zone extends to surround the Italian island of Lampedusa. And here you have the island of Malta with an extremely vast search and rescue zone. Now, as you see, those search and rescue zones overlap. Not only do they spatially overlap, but Italy and Malta have signed different versions of the conventions concerning search and rescue. Essentially, Italy considers that the country in which a vessel in distress is found is responsible for operating and coordinating rescue. Whereas Malta considers that the closest country to which the migrants are found, the closest territory to which they are found, is responsible for operating rescue. This very simply means that whenever migrants leaving the Libyan coast are here, they are in a zone of jurisdictional and responsibility conflict. And this conflict over responsibility has been mobilized repeatedly by states to avoid operating rescue. We'll see this in a minute in relation to several cases. Very simply because coastal states, European coastal states, have somehow a principled reluctance to operate rescue because of the Dublin Conventions. As you know, the Dublin Conventions established that the state on which an asylum seeker first sets foot is responsible for processing that asylum request. That means that, evidently, states such as Spain, Italy, Greece, Malta, are made responsible for processing the asylum requests of the people they disembark, and thus have a principled reluctance not to do so, which does not diminish the fact that, for example, the Italian Coast Guard has often been, depending on the political climate, has been conducting rescue on a large scale and in a very courageous way as well. Now, these conflicts of responsibility between states for rescue and disembarkation has also meant that seafarers who rescued migrants could be accused, could be criminalized for having done so, accused of favoring illegal migration, in Italy in particular. This was the case of Tunisian fishermen in 2009, who were finally acquitted, but the deterrent effect of such criminalization was very real. Alternatively, they can find themselves with tens or even several hundred passengers on their deck and not be able to disembark them for days or even weeks of standoff between coastal states. As you can imagine, this criminalization and these conflicts over disembarkation is extremely deterrent for seafarers transiting in this area, for them to comply with what is, and what many recognize as well, as their obligation to operate rescue. So, for example, this is a case in 2013 in which passengers on board a migrant's boat, who were in distress, clung to a tuna fishing cage. When the Tunisian fishermen came back to pull out their fishing nets and saw the migrants, they simply cut off the fishing net and left. This is a case which has never been prosecuted, despite our efforts. In fact, I know the identity of the specific vessel involved, but we could never go further with this investigation. Now, by 2010, as you can see from the statistics on this graph, essentially, the Mediterranean had been sealed off, mostly through the collaboration between European states and the EU itself, and authoritarian states on the southern shores of the Mediterranean, such as Libya or Tunisia, through which European states outsourced or externalized border control. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with the different agreements between the Italian state and the Gaddafi regime. That nearly sealed frontier, however, would be reopened in 2011 when the very states Europe had relied on to police its borders came crashing down with the Arab uprisings. And initially, just after the fall of the Ben Ali regime, nearly 30,000 Tunisians seized the freedom to move that they had been denied. At the time, many journalists, European journalists, were wondering, are these Tunisians not betraying the revolution? Why are you not staying in your country? You've just done a revolution. Why are you leaving Tunisia? Most of the Tunisians that we met who attempted or succeeded in the crossing, when we put this question to them, said, no, I'm not betraying the revolution. I did the revolution in Zarzis. And after getting rid of the Ben Ali regime, I seized another dimension of the freedom that had been denied to us. And during this time, crossings were occurring in broad daylight to the sound of darbukas and chanting, which does not mean that, which does not diminish the fact that there were several boats that capsized during this time, and several hundred people crossing from Tunisia remain missing to this day. And by the way, since we're here, an important mobilization in Tunisia was led by the families of the disappeared. Now, as the uprising in Libya was very quickly repressed with violent means and escalated into a civil war which was only accentuated with the international military intervention, several 100,000 people fled mostly to neighboring countries. But as of March 2011, migrants who had, for many of them, worked in Libya for several years and who were now trapped in the midst of this conflict began crossing the sea as well in extremely precarious conditions, at times at the point of the gun. And these renewed crossings, but also these renewed deaths, by June 2011, I believe, there were more than 1,500 people who had been recorded as dead in the Mediterranean. These crossings and deaths were occurring in a very particular context, which I just alluded to, that of the deployment of the NATO-led military intervention off the coast of Libya, towards which, as you see here, on the 24th of March 2011, 38 warships were deployed. This made, very simply, this stretch of sea the most monitored maritime space on Earth at the time. And so, in light of these deaths, despite this extraordinarily high level of surveillance, a small French NGO called the GISTI announced in June 2011 that it would file a complaint against NATO, the EU, and all states taking part in the coalition off the coast of Libya, arguing that because of this level of surveillance, state actors could not know of the distress of migrants, and by failing to assist them, they were guilty of the crime of non-assistance. And we decided to focus on a specific incident, now known as the Left to Die boat case, an incident as well in which Father Zerai played a central role. This is Dan Haile Gebre, one of the survivors. It's okay, don't worry about it. Who is describing the trajectory of this boat that left Libya with 72 people on board, and which was abandoned to drift for 14 days, and only 9 people survived. They were short on fuel, and they were drifting in the waves. And after 5 to 6 days, almost half of the 72 passengers were dead. After all these things, they met a French, what he believes was a French ship, and they asked for help. They showed the bodies, but they left. And after this, maybe 6 days after, they arrived in Zlítan, where they were arrested and detained. Father Zerai they called Father Zerai during their trajectory to ask for help, and Father Zerai passed on the distress signal and call to all competent actors, Italy, Malta, NATO, and called them constantly for several days, but none of them assisted these passengers, despite the full knowledge they had of their distress and of the fate of slow deaths that they were being abandoned to.
Juste comme il n'y avait pas le son, il y a le film Liquid Trace qui montre tout ça, et vous pouvez le voir sur Internet.
This interview itself is also fully available online. Now, this was essentially the beginning of our own work concerning deaths at sea. So now I'm moving into, I think you've noticed, while in the first parts these were more introductory comments on somehow the history of the phenomena of deaths and migrants at sea and the main mechanisms involved. Here I'm moving to, I'm zooming in somehow, moving to a more fine-grained analysis, both of cases and specific policy shifts and practices that have led to the death of migrants since 2011, the phase on which I have mostly been working. Now, in fact, in this incident, initially all we had were the testimonies of the survivors, collected by Father Zerai and journalists. Soon, as part of a parliamentary inquiry, one single image emerged for this incident. This image, an image of the boat early on in its trajectory, taken by a French patrol aircraft and sent to the Italian Coast Guard with the exact coordinates of the boat. But apart from this image, no other image was accessible to us. And so what we had to try and do to understand, to reconstruct this event, and was to try and create, if you will, a kind of composite image based on many different sources of data and evidence. So what we did was, first of all, conduct very detailed interviews with the survivors. Again, this is the interview with Dan Haile Gebre, which we met with Mousse in Milan in December 2011. But also we relied on distress signals, which we could access, which contain specific geolocalized information. So information on place, the location of the boat at a specific moment in time. And so we knew that all vessels in the area had been informed of the passengers' distress and the location of their boats. We then reconstructed the vessel's trajectory from its estimated point of drift, thanks to the support of an oceanographer, which thus allowed to reconstruct the drift of the boat during 14 days. And as you see, the margin of error diminishes as we arrive at the certain point of arrival in relation to the estimated area of the beginning of the drift. And the question was then, we know the trajectory of the boat, we know that all vessels in the area were informed. Well, where were those 38 warships indicated as being deployed 3 days before the migrants departed from the coast of Tripoli? So for that we used satellite imagery, which is only 75-meter resolution, so it does not allow us to identify the ships in question, but allows us to identify the presence of large ships, several of which must be military, in vicinity to the drifting boat here indicated with this yellow patch. And so we produced a more than 100-page report on this incident, reconstructed meticulously the trajectory of this boat and these different moments of interaction. Here, the aircraft sighting, here the moments of encounter with the helicopter, here the beginning of the drift of the vessel, and here around this area, this encounter with the warship, which remains unidentified to this day. And this report was the basis, again I won't show it since we don't have sound apparently, but it's okay, the video is available online, and this video, Liquid Traces, offers a synthetic reconstruction of the events for those who would not want to read more than 100-page of our report.
On peut essayer avec le son, peut-être.
Should we try?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Voilà,
something is
c'est bon.
happening.
C'est moi qui-
Oh, no.
Non.
Should I take this off? Don't worry about it.
Okay.
It's fine. I've conveyed essentially our reconstruction of the events.
You can hear with your computer.
Sorry?
You could hear with your computer.
Oh, it's really the sound is really not good enough there. But anyway, this report was the basis for several legal cases in front of the different states taking part in this coalition, some of which have not gone any further, have ended, others which are still ongoing. And as you see, this gives you an indication that the demand for justice and accountability is a long and long process. Now, I want to move to a second important moment of change at the maritime frontier, that which is triggered by the Lampedusa shipwreck, the 3rd of October 2013, which we began with. I'm sure this is also an important case for your work, since it is one of the incidents which has allowed the identification of many, not all, but many of the passengers. This case was, there was also another shipwreck just at the time on the 11th of October, which was another, by the way, this incident, the legal process as well concerning it is also still ongoing. And we have never been able to fully establish the conditions in which it occurred. But several of the survivors indicate that there were other boats that were in vicinity as the boats began burning less than 1 kilometer from Lampedusa. And those vessels are still unidentified to this day. But another shipwreck occurred barely a week after, on the 11th of October 2013. And once again involved a conflict between the responsibility of Italy and Malta, and led to the death of more than 200 people as a result of that conflicting responsibility. These two consecutive shipwrecks triggered very important consequences. They triggered large public outcry, and they forced many different actors to reposition themselves. On the one hand, on the modest level of non-governmental actors, it's really in response to those shipwrecks that several members of the Watch the Med network thought, we can't, how many cases of non-assistance can we document? What might we have done if the passengers had not only called the Coast Guard, but had also called a network of civil society on both shores of the Mediterranean that might have pressured those state actors into complying with their obligations. And so this is how the Watch the Med alarm phone project was born, very much modeling ourselves on the work that Father Zerai has been doing on an individual basis since years, and in a sense seeking to support and collectivize the work that he has been doing admirably since many years through a wide network of activists, more than 150 activists located on both shores of the Mediterranean. Now, these shipwrecks triggered other deep political changes. In fact, as you see, in the days after the shipwreck, the airport of Lampedusa was transformed into a temporary mortuary, but also into a production studio for news production. And this is really important in relation, again, if you think of the image with which I began of the 3rd of October celebration this year, in which no state representative made the efforts to come. This is a moment, on the contrary, in which there is widespread public outrage, which forces as well politicians to take a stand position themselves. And here you have Barroso, Enrico Letta, Giuseppe Nicolini. And Barroso, at this moment and in the days after, of course, deplores these dead. These are unacceptable deaths at the footstep of Europe. But the rest of his speech is not, as we might want to hope and expect, announcing the end of the policies of illegalization and militarization, which have led to these deaths on a structural basis over so many years. But rather, it is the announcement of the launching of Eurosur, the European surveillance system, and the doubling of the budget of Frontex's operation in the central Mediterranean, i.e. more of the deadly medicine that has led to the structural deaths of migrants for so long. Italy, however, did lead a very important break with what we just saw was its principled policy of reluctance to operate rescue by deploying the Mare Nostrum operation, a humanitarian and security operation through which the Italian military deployed several assets close to the Libyan coast, rescuing proactively migrants departing from Libya and disembarking them by default on Italian territory. As of that moment, until, as you will see recently, cases of non-assistance and conflict over rescue practically ceased to exist. Now, with Mare Nostrum, the military was happy to, display itself in the role of savior, humanitarian savior. But clearly, this was a humanitarian and security operation, which also allowed fingerprinting even on board the warships, swift deportation of Egyptian and Tunisian nationals, identification of so-called smugglers, often migrants who have simply been handed a satellite phone and the role of driving, but who are absolutely not connected to the organized criminal networks of smugglers. But also, this operation, as important as it was limited even if in its aim of saving lives. As you see in 2014, the year during which Mare Nostrum was deployed, more than 3,000 deaths were recorded at the maritime frontiers, in the central Mediterranean specifically. So even though Mare Nostrum did succeed in bringing the mortality rate down in relation to the October shipwrecks, for example, really October 2013 is really what we see as a tipping point in the dynamics of migration. On the one hand, it's the beginning of the large-scale crossings of Syrians, but also important increase in crossings by Eritreans. And on the other hand, it's really a moment where we see severe worsening in the conditions of smuggling and increasingly dangerous conditions of crossing. So Mare Nostrum did succeed in bringing down the mortality rate, which was, of course, very important, but not in ending the deaths of migrants at sea, simply because this humanitarian and security operation could only mitigate the effects of European policies of exclusion, illegalization, that remained in place. But clearly, what worried European policymakers was not those increasing numbers of deaths, but rather that an increasing number of people was succeeding in arriving on European shores alive. And for an important share of them, probably some nearly 50%, they were able to continue on their way further north, and were putting in crisis the Dublin and the Schengen systems. And so when Italy requested the Europeanization of the Mare Nostrum operation, European states declined. For example, UK Foreign Office Minister Lady Anna Ley stated, "We do not support planned search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean. We believe that they create an unintended pull factor, encouraging more migrants to attempt the dangerous crossing, and thereby leading to more tragic and unnecessary deaths." Again, in the scheme that I'm somehow presenting to you, and which is important for us in understanding these shifts, you still see that we are here in a moment of what William Walters has called the humanitarian border. That is a moment in which security policies are framed within a humanitarian discourse. Not supporting Mare Nostrum and non-replacing it, if you will, as we'll see in a second, by a more limited Frontex operation, clearly the aim was to, as UN rapporteur François Crépeau at the time clearly saw, the aim was clearly to deter migrants from crossing. But even this policy of deterrence was framed as an act of saving, right? We need to deter migrants to prevent unnecessary deaths. So instead, they proposed a much more limited operation Triton, which you see was not only more limited spatially, but also had a completely different operational logic. It was a border and security operation rather than a humanitarian one. Even if Frontex assets could be called to operate rescue, they were not doing so proactively, but only as a side effect, if you will, of their border control focused operation. And as many organizations across the board warned that, contrary to the hopes of European policymakers, people will attempt the crossing with or without Operation Mare Nostrum in place, but without it, many more will die. This was in September 2014, before the operation was ended. Similar warnings were made by many different actors from the UNHCR, but also, for example, the European merchant shipping community. And effectively, as we demonstrate in our report, Death by Rescue, the lethal effects of the EU's policies of non-assistance, this is effectively the reality that began to unfold in early 2015. Essentially, the same number of people crossed the sea, but the danger of crossing increased exponentially. And in 2 shipwrecks on the 12th and 18th of April 2015, more than 1,200 people died in barely a week, right? 400 and 800. A figure which MSF at the time stated is a figure from a war zone. And in the 18th of what was striking for us after having worked for so long on practices of non-assistance is that in fact both these shipwrecks of April occurred at the moment where merchant ships were attempting to rescue the passengers. That is, there was no failure in the obligation to operate rescue that we could document. In the case of the 18th of April, you have to imagine a 15 or 18 meter wooden fishing vessel in the middle of the night, overloaded with more than 800 people, extremely unstable, being approached by a 147 meter cargo ship in the middle of the night to operate what is very simply the most difficult and dangerous rescue operation you can imagine. Again, the rescue community had warned before the ending of Mare Nostrum that this would put a much greater burden on their shoulder. And in fact, at the end of March, they had sent another press release after a smaller scale incident had occurred, also at the moment of rescue, warning that Europe must reinstate a proactive rescue operation because there is a risk of catastrophic loss of life, right? That catastrophic loss of life really materialized, I think, beyond, in fact, anyone's imagination in those 2 shipwrecks. And so what we show in this report, based on these 2 cases, but also others, is that even though these cases did not result from practices of non-assistance of the actors involved, they rather were the product of a policy of non-assistance, which was implemented in full knowledge of the lethal consequences that it would have. This incident, the 18th of April shipwreck, you know, the wreck has been taken out of the sea 1 year after, and the identification of the dead is ongoing, but my understanding is that it's been a very slow and difficult process so far. In fact, after these shipwrecks, even Jean-Claude Juncker was obliged to recognize European responsibility when he stated, "It was a serious mistake to bring Mare Nostrum operation to an end. It cost human lives." Now, we would fundamentally contest, even though this is an important admission of guilt, we would fundamentally contest the qualification of the ending of the Mare Nostrum operation as a mistake. This was again a policy implemented in full knowledge from warning as well of the lethal consequences as well coming from internal reports from Frontex. But nonetheless, it's a very important admission of guilt. Now, I'm sure that, like myself, you all expect that if there has been a public policy which has entailed the loss of human lives, there's going to be an immediate investigation into this public policy. Someone is going to be put on trial. Someone is going to lose his or her job. In fact, the next sentence in this statement is that the Frontex operation budget of Triton will be tripled and its operations slightly extended in the following weeks. Another operation, UNAFROMED, would be an anti-smuggling operation would be launched as well. And neither of these operations had, as Mare Nostrum did, a fundamentally humanitarian and proactive rescue mandate at the core of its operations. And so this is the context in which non-governmental actors sought to make up for the lethal gap in rescue capacity left by the retreat of state actors. At the same time, re-expanding its security operations at sea in the first months of 2015, it was also seeking to implement a new policy, the hotspot approach, which essentially entailed a Europeanized mechanisms and centers to force coastal states to re-implement the fingerprinting of people arriving on their shores and prevent the unraveling, once again, of the Dublin system. Now, all these neat plans, which largely failed as well in relation to the relocation as well, which was the counterpart somehow offered to coastal states. We demand that you fingerprint, once again, the people arriving on your shores, but in exchange, we will organize a Europeanized relocation system to take away part of the burden that this system puts on your shoulders. And these relocations never actually materialized to anything close to the planned numbers. But in fact, all of this system in practice crumbled during what we call the Summer of Migration, when more than 800,000 people arrived on Greek shores. You see simply the staggering scale of arrivals during that year. Very importantly, for what concerns our discussion on the mechanisms of death at sea, as you see, 2015 did see, once again, a very important number of deaths, most of which were, however, in the central Mediterranean. There were deaths in the Aegean, but much fewer. And importantly, in relation to the number of arrivals, this was actually, as you see from this graph, this was in fact the lowest level in the mortality rate in the last 15 years, right? So this is in fact very important, I think, for all of us, because despite the claims by states to deploy their operations in the name of saving lives, despite even the humanitarian aims of NGOs, etc., deploying their vessels, in fact, the single greatest factor in reducing mortality at sea over the last years has been the shift towards the Aegean route, which is of course a much shorter stretch of sea and an area in which crossings are operated either by much less criminal networks or even at times in rather self-organized fashion, contrary to the highly structured and criminal networks operating in Libya. Now, following these large-scale arrivals that triggered a deep political crisis in Europe, we still hear the term migration crisis being used. I think it's really fundamental to always remember that this is really a political, a policy crisis triggered not, certainly the scale of arrivals was important, but not only or simply by that scale, but really by European inability to offer a consolidated and solidary response to these arrivals. The EU first began erecting new forms of control along the Balkan routes to prevent onward movements. But very clearly they realized that as soon as migrants arrived on European shores, European states are simply unable to manage the presence of those frail bodies, unable to offer an adequate political response. And so the EU and its member states really embarked on a new wave of policies of externalization, essentially trying to reinstate the successive rims of control that had been in place prior to 2011 and that the Arab uprisings had brought down. So you are all familiar with, I'm sure, the EU-Turkey deal in March 2016, which very quickly led to a sharp decrease in the number of arrivals in the Aegean. But the central Mediterranean route remained wide open, and in fact, in 2016, there were actually more crossings being recorded, and the central Mediterranean became the focus of European policymakers. And Italy, in particular, which after all was put under tremendous pressure by the hotspot system, but also upcoming national elections, of which we now know the outcome. Italy embarked on very strong policy to seal off, once again, the central Mediterranean route as well. Now, the central Mediterranean route was extremely challenging until then. First of all, because, as you all know, there is no state that we can qualify as such in Libya. Libya is a completely fragmented political landscape in which there is no unitary actor that controls the territory. So this had made negotiations and the re-implementation of policies of outsourced border control extremely difficult for Italy and the EU until then. But essentially, under Marco Minniti as interior minister at the time, Italy implemented at sea specifically, but also beyond on firm land, a two-pronged policy of criminalization of rescue on the one hand and outsourcing of border control to the Libyan Coast Guard, but also to militias. And since this operation, which had a very clear logic to it, as I'll try to show, had not been given any fancy name as Mare Nostrum, Triton, Poseidon, European policymakers seem to have an endless imagination in the new operation names that they find. But strangely, this operation had no name. And so we decided to call it Mare Clausum. And so at first, what became a very strong tendency was a virulent campaign of delegitimization of the rescue NGOs, which had courageously stepped in to make up for the lethal absence of states. And at first what we saw was essentially the recycling of the same pull factor discourse that had been used against Mare Nostrum, and which the ending of Mare Nostrum had demonstrated the fallacy. The ending of Mare Nostrum, first of all, increasing crossings began before Mare Nostrum, and the same number of crossings continued after Mare Nostrum. Nevertheless, this discourse was recycled and easily applied once again against NGOs who were further accused of strengthening the business model of smugglers. Now, in our report blaming the rescuers, we show, of course, we mentioned the precedent of the ending of Mare Nostrum, but we show also that the increase that was attributed to NGOs began before they were deployed in important numbers. It was mainly the product of, essentially we see that in 2015, Syrians stopped crossing through the central Mediterranean after the April shipwrecks, and they crossed through the Aegean. And so it gave the impression that there were less crossings. But in fact, that same year, there was already an increasing number of sub-Saharan migrants crossing once again through the central Mediterranean from Nigeria, Côte d'Ivoire, Sudan, etc., etc. And a similar increase is recorded as well at the time, 2015, 2016, in the Western Mediterranean, in absence of any rescue NGO whatsoever. So again, through this kind of contextual analysis, we can show that the presence of SAR NGOs was not the main driver, at least, of the increasing crossings. Secondly, the NGOs were accused of, by their presence, leading to shift in smuggling tactics that were in turn making the crossing more dangerous. And effectively, we could see that in 2016, the use of rubber boats increased dramatically, and often with lesser fuel on board and greater overcrowding. However, according to UNAFOR Med's own reports, that shift from wood to rubber was one of the effects of its own anti-smuggling operations. They boasted themselves that the destruction of wooden vessels by UNAFOR Med was preventing smugglers from recuperating them and reusing them and, if you will, capitalizing on them within their economy of smuggling. And as such, they had a greater incentive to use cheaper rubber boats. There were also shifts that were occurring on firm land, on Libyan soil. And essentially, these were the growing coming together, if you will, between smuggling networks and militias, and really turned into an increasingly violent and scrupulous smuggling/trafficking system. And of course, in such a context, where migrants have less and less agency, those who put them on boats have a less great incentive to offer even minimal security standards, if you will. Now, that does not mean that rescue NGOs were completely lay outside of those dynamics. That would be, I would say, just as absurd as attributing to them any shift in the dynamics of migration. For example, Frontex argued that their presence was correlated with a decrease in the handing over of satellite phones. We can imagine that satellite phones, in conjunction with the other trends that I just mentioned, the shifts in the other actors, that the fact that there were NGOs that could be visible through their IAS presence gave a less great incentive to smugglers to hand over those satellite phones. But the correlation, so-called correlation, because it's not really statistically demonstrated in that case, that nobody mentioned is in fact that we could demonstrate a strong statistical correlation between the number of rescue NGOs deployed and the decrease in the mortality rate at sea. However, at the same time as Italy recycled its anti-search and rescue ideology that had the pull factor discourse, etc., it also increasingly targeted rescue actors for collusion with smugglers. Father Zerai himself, will maybe mention this later, went from being nominated as for the Nobel Prize to standing investigated by a public prosecutor in Trapani. And on the 2nd of August, the Juventa vessel of a small rescue NGO from Germany, Jugendrettet, was seized upon such allegations. In fact, we show in a counter reconstruction that is also available online. Something I just forget. How much time do I have?
En théorie, on devrait avoir déjà fini.
Oh, I'm very sorry about that. So, we show that the discourse and strategies that have been used amount to what we have called factual lies. That is, using a photograph, a statistical graph, a statement that has a factuality to it, as this image. This is an image from the prosecution's document against the Juventa. And as you see, there is a KK marking on the side of this vessel, while it is being pulled by one of the Juventa ribs. And there is no contesting that this vessel is being pulled by the Juventa rib following a rescue. Now, the public prosecutor allegated that, in fact, the Juventa was pulling this vessel towards Libya for reuse by smugglers, which is a complete lie. In fact, what was happening, we demonstrate in our counter reconstruction that the Juventa was pulling, in this instance, the wooden vessel northwards, not towards Libya, as they were accused, and in fact, very simply, had to abandon the vessel because it had to direct itself in emergency towards the 5th rescue that the crew of the Juventa was operating that morning. I just think, you need to realize that these are young people, younger than any of us in this room, who are on these boats, who are rescuing boats overloaded with more than 130, 150 people that can capsize at any second. And they're doing this with the greatest level of professionalism that you can imagine. Usually, they would have actually set that vessel on fire so that it could not be reused and would not constitute a danger for navigation. But in that instance, they had to direct themselves as quickly as possible to the next rescue, which they amazingly performed, right? And so, even though it is true that this boat was used, the vessel marked by KK was reused several days later, there is absolutely no indication and no evidence of that collusion. And so really this is a pattern that we see of what we call factual lies. Now, to conclude quickly on the second dimension of Operation Mare Clausum, externalization of border control to the Libyan Coast Guard, it's very clearly indicated, in fact, by the fact that the 2nd of August is both the date of the seizure of the Juventa, but also that of the deployment of the Italian military operation in Libyan territorial waters, aiming to support the Libyan Coast Guard. In fact, the connection between these two dimensions is fairly logical, I think. If Italy wants the Libyan Coast Guard to intercept and bring back migrants to Libya, those same migrants cannot be rescued and brought back to Italy as well. So the strategy essentially entailed getting humanitarian actors out of the way so that the Libyan Coast Guards could perform those maritime interceptions. And this policy of collaboration was implemented as well through the handing over of assets, through the support to Libya for the institution and declaration of its rescue zone, so as to frame interceptions as rescue activities. And as you see, in fact, over summer 2017, the share of rescue operated by NGOs, I'm concluding, dropped dramatically, while the share of interceptions operated by the Libyan Coast Guard increased exponentially. And this despite, once again, the full knowledge of the horrendous conditions that migrants face once disembarked in Libya. We've produced another report on this policy and the Sea-Watch versus Libyan Coast Guard case, which was the basis for a legal complaint against Italy in front of the European Court, filed on the 8th of May. A complaint, you file a complaint, strategic litigation, you know that the legal process is long, but you hope that even filing a legal case would have some kind of deterrent effect. Clearly that deterrent effect failed with the arrival in the position of Interior Minister of Matteo Salvini, who in fact only increased these two dimensions of the Operation Mare Clausum by closing the ports, and the share of rescue interceptions, rather, as you see here, operated by the Libyan Coast Guard, only continued increasing over the last months. And I would say dramatically for me, for us as well, not only has the mortality rate increased as well during these months, but also we have been recording once again renewed cases of non-assistance, as in this incident of the US Trenton, in which a US warship rescued on the 12th of June 42 passengers, but in fact it has emerged over the last weeks that the Trenton was in visible distance 1 to 2 hours before and refrained from rescuing the passengers, and only intervened after the boat's wooden plank had broken and all passengers fell into water and more than 76 people died. So, you know, it's something quite depressing, if you forgive the term, to be working once again on cases of non-assistance. We're investigating this case right now, and are beginning to analyze satellite imagery. But I think that this is a work that we have to continue to do, so as to prevent the threshold of acceptable death and violations from being lowered any further. And so the work of documenting violations, but also identifying the dead and their families, essentially seeking to treat these victims with humanity is absolutely fundamental. Fundamental in relation to migrants, but also these days I'm thinking again and again of the warning of Aimé Césaire in his 1955 discourse on colonialism, when he says that the colonizer, by dehumanizing the colonized, dehumanizes himself. The colonizer, by training himself in treating the colonizer as a beast, turns himself into a beast. And I think the policies that are being implemented today in the name of European citizens are not only dehumanizing migrants, but also European societies as a whole. And it's in relation to these different dimensions of dehumanization that I think that our collective efforts are absolutely essential. Thanks a lot, and sorry for being too long.
Thank you very much. It was incredible. It puts together all the different ideas or events or things we followed up together in a framework or in a history. I don't know. I was wondering really, well, it's maybe a little bit egoistic from our side, but you were talking about the recent development in the Alps. And if you maybe have some words about this would be great, or maybe also give us some hints where we can find more information, because it's the one thing which is, well, touching us not most. For sure, Italy and all the other borders are touching us a lot, but still it will happen on our territory, so we'll be differently responsible from the Swiss Red Cross perspective, also not from the humanitarian, but from the nationalist perspective.
Should I take several questions, and then since we have so little time, I'm very happy to answer.
Sorry for not being very familiar with the cases, but to what extent can a judicial case clarify the identities of the victims? To what extent will that happen, and how can that work together with the humanitarian approaches to inform families? Or can the judicial approach also fill that purpose?
Great questions. Should I just take those, or one more?
I think it's okay.
So let me start maybe with the second one, which I have to admit I can only answer in an incomplete way. Maybe Mousse, you could also respond later in relation to the Lefte Diebold case, for example, and how the contacts with the families have been connected or not. But I would say that usually it's a relatively separate process. There are some actors, in the case of the Lefte Diebold, Father Zerai was in touch with the families of those who were on board this boat. But I believe that, I forget even now exactly exactly in which families the lawyers themselves were in touch or not. We certainly try to identify the dead by speaking simply with the survivors if they know them. If we seek to contact the families who can file the case also in their own name. So there is part of that, but I would say that, you know, it's not a process that we go, that we are able to go into a lot of detail, and I would say that's precisely why the work that you and other actors are doing is so important, because it's simply beyond our capacity, and I would say very simply expertise. But what I do think is fundamental is to have some kind of shared collaboration, very simply because we are in touch with many of the survivors or the families, and we would need actors to who we could simply pass on that information, those contacts, who could then follow up on that. The Alps, very briefly, I would say that I think that, you know, the dynamic that we see in the Mediterranean in relation to what we call the Mare Clausum operation, criminalization of rescue and violent policies of containment, is really a trend that we're seeing in many different spaces. We see it in the deserts in Niger. We see it in the Alps. Last week, a few Swiss and French and Italian citizens were condemned for assisting migrants in the region above Briançon. And we know that in this area there are recurrent structural violations committed mostly by the French state, who simply pushes back migrants in complete disregard for the law, and including for the young age for minors, right? And so there have been deaths that have been recorded in this area. It's very difficult to record them. Myself, I don't work in detail on that area, so I would not be able to you know, really describe this with the level of detail that would be necessary. But there is, for example, a close friend of mine called Cristina Del Viaggio, who is a Swiss national, but who is now based in Grenoble, who is a geographer working on the Alpine frontier, and who I'm sure would be very happy to be in touch with you as well. I would say that on our end, we will see if this goes further or not, but after several years of focusing strictly on the maritime frontier within the project Forensic Oceanography, we are considering the possibility of somehow expanding the project into what we would call border forensics, i.e. Forensics, still the aim of documenting violence and violations in relation to borders, but expanding to the desert or the mountains while still including the sea. But this is a possibility that we're considering at present.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Désolée de couper court, c'était vraiment très intéressant, je vous remercie beaucoup.